Thank you so much, Vandra and Dupre and Barry. Thank you for that extraordinary musical contribution. I noted on the slide when we were remembering those we'd lost, the phrase "grief is a worthwhile use of our time," and there was so much powerful emotion in that uh, in that. Uh, musical contribution, and it is beyond worthwhile. It's essential. So thank you. I have a strange thing happening, which I can only see myself. I mean, there I go. I found other people. But I am huge. That's that's all
You're
right.
being spotlighted.
I got it. I got
Time.
it. It is a delight to be here. And what I was thinking about when I was putting together this, what I'd like to do today is just read and talk a little bit about what led me to write this book and the stories that are in it. And what would an HIV doula do, with which Vandra mentioned is an artist activist collective that understands HIV to be an ongoing process, a moment of transition, like all illness, like birth, like death. These are not things that are singular points in time. We move through them, we carry them with us. And it's a practice of, it's a group where our practice often begins with asking questions. And one of our members, Ted Kerr, often says, or this was what I was thinking about as I was walking here from my house this morning, and I should say, I appreciate the land acknowledgement and add my own acknowledgement that I am joining you today from Gowanus, Brooklyn, and its unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples. Ted, borrowing from the Black Christian feminist ethicist and theologian Tracy West, says the stories we tell dictate our actions, and where we begin indicates our bias. Which I found when I went to look up the quote just before we began today, because in my head, what I've turned it into is where we begin indicates our ethics. And that's what I was going to say and bring to you. I am a graduate of the ethical culture school, and I that has shaped me, as has the work of figuring out how to situate oneself as a witness in a story that is belongs to all of us and also belongs to specific communities in particular ways, and the ethics of approaching that storytelling has been really important to me. So I hope, and I'm excited to be in dialogue today around this idea of how we tell stories that reflect our ethics with our best efforts. Where do we begin, and what actions does it dictate? And so also I was thinking as I was coming here that I've done many readings since the book came out in July, and I have never actually begun a reading at the beginning of my book. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder why I haven't done that. So this is a community that feels deeply friendly and connected for many of the reasons that Vandra mentioned. And so we're going to start at the beginning today. How about that? It's a first. This is the book. It's called To End a Plague. As you'll discover as we go along, it is personal. I became involved in HIV as a science writer and activist in the mid-90s after potent antiretroviral drugs were identified, the third drug that was missing from the combinations. We had combination therapy in 1996, as the video said, for those who could afford it and could access it. And there were many who couldn't. And many of those people were Black and brown people in our country and beyond our borders. And grotesque inequities opened up, much like what we are living through today. And I became part of the American-based transnational activist coalition that worked to address those inequities. And part of the work that we did ended up impelling enormous action by President Bush. And in 2003, he launched something called the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And it's widely seen as Bush's legacy, which means that the stories of the activists that impelled it, and that have watchdogged it and held it accountable and ensured its continuity are often dropped back into the background, while the idea of a major presidential initiative is foregrounded and perhaps suggesting that there is any moment in history where people in power take great ambitious action to address health and human rights without a force behind them. So the book is my contribution to a history of the many forces that impel change. That being said, it does actually start with George Bush, which may be why I seldom start my readings with it, but we're going to see what happens. And thank you for being along for the ride. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to just start on page 1 from the prologue, and then we'll read a few different sections, all of which are the really beginnings, and I'll talk a little bit about what happened later, but I hope it'll also give us a chance to reflect together on this idea of how to tell stories that dictate action that changes the world in the ways that we hope it will change, and what it means when we select a beginning, and what beginning are we selecting right now. So here we go with the prologue. On January 28th, 2003, the night President George W. Bush launched America's war on AIDS in Africa, he brought the whirlwind with him. In fact, it had seldom left his side. In his 2001 inaugural address, the president twice quoted a letter to Thomas Jefferson from his friend and fellow slave-owning politician, John Page. "We know the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Do you not think an angel rides in the whirlwind and directs this storm?" Page penned those words after congratulating Jefferson on the Declaration of Independence, conjoining American governance and divine providence. Some of Bush's supporters did much the same, seeing divine intervention in an election settled by a Supreme Court decision. At first, the president's whirlwind seemed merely metaphorical, but 235 days after his inauguration, twin columns of air roiled at the bottom of Manhattan Island. Ever since, even on clear days, America had dwelt within a storm. "In a whirlwind of change and hope and peril, our faith is sure, our resolve is firm, and our union is strong," the president said on that January 28th in his State of the Union address. If he did not name the angel this time, perhaps it was because he intended to assume its earthly avenging form. Like many viewers of the speech who hadn't voted for Bush, I tuned in dreading a declaration of war on Iraq. 2 months prior, Congress had authorized use of force. Millions of people around the world had taken to the streets to protest, but the White House's zeal for war had not slackened. I turned on the speech because I understood witness as an act of resistance. He would not catch those who vehemently opposed violence and vengeance by surprise. In the opening minutes of the speech, Bush hardly projected holy clarity. His eyes darted and his mouth seemed a separate living thing, wriggling, flattening, and bunching up with helminthic volition. But after his promise of hydrogen-powered cars, his voice softened, grew hoarse with sincerity. My sense of watching a badly dubbed soap opera disappeared. He began to talk about something that interested him: getting drunk. He'd met a Louisiana addict in recovery. "God does miracles in people's lives," that man had said to the president. "You never think it could be you." The putty of Bush's face softened with an inwardly directed tenderness when he spoke those words. He could not make himself the subject, of course, but he had been frank about his own alcoholism and recovery. Against my will, I warmed toward him just then. We know each other, drunks and recovering drunks. On that January night, I was 29 years old, sitting in my apartment in downtown Brooklyn, wrapped in the duvet I had brought to college my senior year. If asked, an AIDS activist and journalist. That was what I did, but I was not always sure who I was, and so I loved nothing more than when, after a third or fourth glass of wine, I could at last hear my voice at a distance. Bush finished the story about recovery in Louisiana with a plea for people to embrace God's wonder-working power, then hopscotched from a condemnation of partial birth abortion to a call for a law against human cloning, staking the state's claim to control corporeality in all its forms, from womb to cell. Divine might manifested as governmental jurisdiction over bodies. His voice was firm and his sentence flowed. Something was coming. Just after 9:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, he looked at the camera again. Today, on the continent of Africa, nearly 30 million people have the AIDS virus, including 3 million children under the age of 15, he said. I recognized the facts that were a catechism for me and many others working on global AIDS. That's got quotes around it. An American neologism for the epidemic beyond US borders. There are whole countries where more than 1/3 of the adult population carries the infection. More than 4 million require immediate drug treatment. Yet across that continent, only 50,000 AIDS victims, only 50,000, he repeated himself, as we activists did in our own speeches, marveling at the humanity, are receiving the medicine they need. His words ended years of American negligence. With a scant handful of sentences, Bush launched the largest disease-specific foreign aid effort in the history of the country and the world. He also brought an end to an era of shameful American heel-dragging over whether people in Africa living with HIV and dying of AIDS deserved access to the medications that had changed HIV from a death sentence to a chronic disease in people who could afford them. In the years to come, members of Congress would call the president's plan the most effective American foreign aid since the Marshall Plan, the legendary post-World War II effort to rebuild Europe and head off Soviet alliances. The program that would be known as the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, would meet the goals set in the State of the Union ahead of schedule and go on hitting or surpassing them across 3 presidential administrations and 8 Congresses. We who worked on AIDS knew none of this that night, but we did know that while a virus can cause illness, it is human actions that allow the virus first to spread until it inhabits enough bodies that a, quote, outbreak has occurred, and then to continue to spread until its presence has reached epidemic or pandemic proportions. We knew that the actions that fueled the epidemic were not condomless sex acts or shared syringes, but the laws passed and stigma dispensed by members of society who despised homosexuals, denigrated women, and deplored drug use. HIV lived in blood and body fluids. Each act of transmission occurred as a result of 2 people drawing close. But we knew that the propagation of pathogens to epidemic levels is not inexorable except in the context of human negligence. Just going to write to the end of the prologue here about, we all were immensely surprised about that by this announcement. It was a program that was developed in complete secrecy, which I'll talk about a bit later. The vast majority of people living with HIV, as well as scientists, activists, doctors, nurses, and politicians who had been fighting for access to AIDS drugs for all, had not seen it coming. In hotel rooms and homes, groping for our phones, exclaiming, sweating in the hot flush of committing sodomy, as one friend ritually did with his husband on the occasion of Bush's State of the Union address, we felt the words in our blood. Or perhaps we felt our blood in the president's words. We heard him say things we had said for years prior, the same statistics, the same insistence that the medications that had saved some lives should save all lives. He'd claimed the plan as his, the president's, but we knew whom else it belonged to. Because we worked on HIV, we knew that the symptoms of the virus can take years to appear. The moment the virus arrives in the body is not the moment it announces itself. Often the first symptoms come after years of unseen attempts at self-protection by the body and its brilliant immune system. Such is the subterfuge of infection and historic change. That which is visible is not the beginning, but the result of a struggle that has been going on for some time. So that's the prologue. And then I want to offer you some alternative beginnings, which the book proposes, and one of them is back in 1999, so 4 years prior to Bush's State of the Union. One of the things that he says in the State of the Union He marvels at how affordable the drugs have become. That now the drugs, which used to cost tens of thousands of dollars, cost $300 a year, about $1 a day, and he marvels at that. And that becomes a moment, that moment that the drugs become affordable really changes the sense that you can do a major foreign aid effort to purchase these drugs and make them available in countries where the idea of chronic treatment for any illness is really unheard of, where we're talking about communities where health systems for ambulatory care, for chronic disease care, whether for diabetes or hypertension or HIV, simply don't exist. And so the idea that we would be paying for and asking for chronic treatment for HIV, which is a complex, costly regimen, was extraordinary. And that's why it was shocking, and it was extraordinary that Bush took it on. But he could do it because the prices of the medications had come down. And they had not come down because of the government. In fact, they had come down in spite of the government. And they'd come down in spite of efforts, not only by the Bush administration, but by the prior administration, President Bill Clinton and Al Gore. So we're gonna go back to 1999. I think we all look like time travelers here. So we're gonna do that now, right? We were in 2003, we're heading back to 99. And we're in New York City. And we're in New York City at a moment when Rudy Giuliani is the mayor, when we're living through a sort of Disneyfication of some of our public spaces, gentrification in the name of reclaiming the city coming out of economic downturn, and seeing gentrification used as a way to privatize, to sanitize, to otherize. And there's activism that is also centered in groups that feel that the outlaw liberation work that was done by queer activists leading up to the identification of AIDS drugs is unfinished. There's more to be done. And there's more to be done in a global space. And those groups are working together. They're pulling in sexual and reproductive health activists who have been working for political justice and against American neocolonialism. And like all good activist organizing, it starts in a basement. So we're going to go to an activist meeting in a basement. And a activist named Sharon Ann Lynch, who's also a dear friend and comrade of mine, who had founded with a couple of other activists a group called Fed Up Queers, whose acronym was FUQ, which gave everybody a chuckle. Fed Up Queers in the protests against the police shooting of Amadou Diallo was, they were the first to be arrested in civil disobedience. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time with Sharon Ann Lynch. One night, Lynch arrived in the basement where Bob Lederer, John Riley, and Eric Sawyer, who are all members of this activist group that are beginning to try to grapple with inequities and access to HIV medications, and are putting together a group to tackle it. They were debating whether the group's mission statement ought to encompass micronutrients. She'd mastered ACT UP's organizing discipline. You knock down every barrier. Behind every barrier, there's a person who can give you what you want. In the weeks that followed, as winter turned into spring in New York City and Philadelphia, the groups tried to apply this discipline to the chasm in access to AIDS medications. They started with what they knew. Drugs cost whatever the patent holder decided to charge, at least in the United States, where generic manufacture of a compound at a cheaper price was prohibited until the patent expired. They quickly learned that not all countries were willing to play by American rules. Brazil recognized patents on the process by which the molecule was made, but not the molecule itself. A Brazilian laboratory that could reverse engineer a molecule could make it, even if that meant breaking the patent. Thailand, too, had both the capacity and a national framework for manufacturing cheap generic medications, resources that both the US government and pharma, the US pharmaceutical lobby, regularly pressured it not to use. Similarly, post-apartheid South Africa had a law called the Medicines Act that enshrined the nation's right to make or import generic medications in the context of health emergencies. One of the provisions involved in exercising this right was known as compulsory licensing, a term that referred to government-sanctioned production of a patented product or process without the consent of the patent holder. Another key provision was parallel importing, in which a country obtained a non-counterfeit version of a product made without permission of the patent holder, such as a drug made under compulsory license. As the group gathered information, asked questions, and emailed experts, they also came to understand how the US government intervened to protect drug companies' patents. Starting in 1997, the US government had, at the behest of the pharmaceutical lobby, pressured South Africa to back away from either the use of either compulsory licensing or parallel importing. The Clinton administration placed South Africa on the watch list of the Office of the US Trade Representative and subsequently refused to request tariff reductions until South Africa made progress on its intellectual property provisions. Progress is in quotes, it's what the government asked South Africa to consider. Both US Trade Representatives Charlene Barshevsky and Vice President Al Gore specifically raised concerns about the provisions in private meetings with the country's elected leaders, including President Thabo Mbeki. When the activists figured out that the White House was stumping for drug companies and not the lives of newly liberated South Africans, they knew they had a media-ready story. They also knew the power of pointing the finger at a single person. Clinton occupied the Oval Office, but it was his vice president, Al Gore, whose public image was most vulnerable. Clinton was set to leave the White House. Gore was about to launch his own presidential campaign. I'd ended up on Sharon Ann Lynch's B list of activists, meaning I could not be relied upon to risk arrest. So literally, she had an A list and a B list. And I was good at writing press releases. I was less fond of getting arrested. Still, she knew she needed bodies in the street, which was why in June 1999, I got a call for a weekend meeting in an apartment on East 11th Street. Gore was going to declare his presidential candidacy in Carthage, Tennessee in a few days' time. At that meeting, Lynch sat with a steno notebook flipped open in her lap. What if the activist drove down to Carthage and disrupted the announcement of his candidacy? Could people do that? There is nothing remarkable at all about the moment that a decision gets made that will change everything. People checked their work schedules, they considered who would rent a car, they talked about how long it would take to drive down. The proposition hung as a bubble in midair, and then there was an astringent clarity. People would drive overnight and confront the candidate when he declared. What would they chant? AIDS drugs for Africa. Gore's greed kills. I helped with the order of the words. Lynch grinned with one side of her mouth and produced, as if out of thin air, a sticker for me, a gold star, as though she knew that I was best suited for watching than finding the words. So what happens after that? The first mention of AIDS drugs for Africa as a demand appears in the New York Times in the article about Gore declaring his candidacy. The activists who drove to Carthage get in a van and drive up to Manchester, New Hampshire. And the candidate thinks that there's a lot of us. I'm not doing this, by the way, B-list all the way. But they drive up and they disrupt his next appearance. And they zap him, as they like to say, multiple times over the next 10 weeks. Okay, they're everywhere that he is. And the result eventually is that the pressure comes off. South Africa comes off the watch list. The US relaxes its approach to intellectual property for AIDS medications. It is not overnight, but it is remarkably fast. And the drug prices do come down, and they come down to around $1 a day. George Bush cites that price in his State of the Union. What happens to our story if we start it with the activists versus the president? One of the ways that I think about that, the potency of that intervention, is that in the law that makes PEPFAR a reality, makes Bush's program a reality, the price that he quotes, the speech is quoted, but the price, $300 a year, is redacted in the law, in the American law. It has asterisks through it. It is too dangerous to write that price because that price reflects an activist victory. So what happens when the truth about our story is redacted from the record, right? There are all these moments. I'm going to do one more beginning and then end, if you will. What happens, though, I would say, if we remember that this is recent history, this is touchable history, this is what we are facing right now. It was not a massive movement that got AIDS drugs for Africa. It was groups of people sitting together and deciding to get in a car and drive overnight. And as we think about what is needed, I think that is a place to begin. May dictate our actions. I want to the final beginning is the beginning of my friendship and comradeship and co-conspiratorship with an activist named Millie Katana, who is in Uganda. She's a Ugandan woman living with HIV. And we are now in 2001, so we're time traveling just a little bit more. By the time Millie Katana walked into my room at the Hotel Africana on Wampewo Road in Kampala. She was one of the most prominent Ugandans living with HIV and a member of the National Guidance and Empowerment Network, a group of people living with HIV founded by Major Rubaramira Ruranga, a barrel-chested, gravel-voiced military man who'd been diagnosed and publicly disclosed his status in the early 1990s. When Katana was diagnosed 5 years prior to our meeting in 1995, she'd been devastated for herself and for her mother, who had spared everything from the small salary she earned as a cook at an agricultural college in the Luwero district to send her only daughter to secondary school. I was very hardworking, very determined. Because I was the only daughter, I behaved more like the boys. There was no difference like a girl does this, a boy does that, Katana told me. Her family, which had lost almost all of its income during the Civil War for which Luwero was an epicenter, could not afford college tuition. But Katana had won a government scholarship and moved into Mary Stuart Hall on the campus of Makerere University, the country's most prestigious university. I was staying with all of these children of rich people, and I think I had one pair of open-toed shoes. My mother gave me her blanket to go to school. So Katana had been determined to do as well as, if not better than, the children who'd gone to the first world schools of the country. She was the only woman in her accounting class and rose to become a minister for gender in the university's parliamentary-based government. She secured a job at a publishing company even before graduating. By the time she received her diagnosis, she had managed to buy a plot of land, but was living in a one-room rented house where she found she could neither eat nor sleep, thinking, after all the effort my mother has put into educating me, I am going to die. Katana had gotten tested because she'd left the publishing company and taken a job at the accounting department of Dr. Peter Mugenyi's Joint Clinical Research Center. I didn't know much about what the organization did. I saw so many people coming in, and I recall asking my colleague, what are all these people doing here? When her coworker explained they were all lining up to participate in research on AIDS, Katana realized the extent of the epidemic. When I saw there were so many people who had HIV, I thought maybe I could have it as well. One day she'd asked a doctor there to draw her blood. Though when she looked in the mirror, the face that gazed back, a prominent forehead under a cap of close cropped curls, a dramatic gap and strong white teeth looked just fine. Keen-eyed and anxious, she'd taken note of the string of numbers the doctor used to anonymize her sample, then returned on her own and found her results in the ledger on her own. She hadn't spoken to the doctor again. She also hadn't spoken to the major the first several times she'd gone to his office. I'm a fast walker. I would sit there for 5 minutes, then run away and disappear, she told me years later. One day he grabbed me, he's an energetic man, and said, Millie, why do you come to my office? In response, she started to cry. Katana explained her status, and Ruranga explained that she needed to come and join his nascent organization run by and for people living with HIV. That, Katana would later say, started my journey into activism. But still, she continued to expect the worst. I hurriedly built my house, really preparing for my death. She also brought piles of bed linens and towels. Looking ahead to a bleak, imminent future, she thought the linen would support whoever would be helping me when I can't get myself out of bed. The house was a little box sitting tight beside a giant water collection tank on a plot of land in Mbuya, a leafy neighborhood to the east of Kampala's small downtown. She put her sheets in a closet and hung a poster of the Makerere University student government from the year she'd been a minister, alongside a photograph of her mother in the compact living room. She was ready to die on her own terms, but she'd go on using her intellect and determination as long as she was able. So what happens if we start our story with Millie? What happens if we start our story with people living with HIV? What happens if we start our story about people in Africa with a story that is about a middle-class educated woman with a degree and a car and ambition? And we are forced to realize that people everywhere are fighting for the same thing, that poverty is not an erasure of identity, that statistics in the millions do not erase the individuals. What happens if we think about our intervention into HIV not as an act of charity? Bush called it a work of mercy, and I don't disparage mercy. I think we need more of it. But what happens if we understand that that mercy is not just for people who need our help? It's for ourselves. In other readings, I would fast forward to the Bush administration, which did indeed take decisive, heroic, and unprecedented action. But I don't want to. I'm also out of time, but I don't want to today, because while it does loop back and it does become then a history of unprecedented foreign aid that we do need to see replicated at scale today, in this group, which paid such attention to the ethics of our work, our lives together, and speech, I'm going to leave you with these questions. What do we do? Where do we start? And what does it feel like to start with Bush or to start with a group of AIDS activists in solidarity with the fight against white supremacy in New York City? What does it feel like to start it with my dear, dear friend and activist to this day, Millie Katana? Thank you for the chance to share these words with you.